Welcome everyone to the Own Voices panel featuring three very special authors, Greg Neri, Diana Ma, and Elle. Elle is the author of Wings of Ebony, a young adult fantasy novel that is both a New York Times and indie bestseller. A former educator, she now spends her spare time mentoring other writers, binge-watching reality TV, or cooking meals inspired by her Louisiana roots. Wings of Ebony follows a Black teenager as she uses her ancestral magic to protect her inner city community. Diana Ma writes middle grade and YA books that feature kick-ass Asian American heroes. Her debut novel, Heiress Apparently, is the first in a romantic YA series that follows fictionalized descendants of the only officially recognized Empress Regent of China. She currently lives in Seattle and teaches at North Seattle College. Greg Neri is the author of many books, including Yummy, Last Days of a Southside Shorty, which won him the Curtis Scott King Award, and Chess Rumble, which won him the Lee Bennett Hopkins Promising Poet Award. His novel Ghetto Cowboy was recently adapted into the Netflix original film Concrete Cowboy. He is currently co-chair of the Antarctic Artists and Writers Collective.
Thank you, Claire, for that wonderful introduction. So just a few housekeeping things for all of the participants here. Please keep your camera and your microphone off for the entirety of the session. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. There are people who are monitoring the chat to send me the questions to ask the authors. Please be sure to go and see any other sessions after this one, but of course, stay the entire time. We want to hear all that they have to say for this one. And I think that should be it. Thank you for coming. And now on to the authors. So the first question we have today for all three of you, I'd love to hear from each of you. How much of your stories come from your own personal experiences or roots, and how much comes from research?
Well, my books are all inspired by real life, but they're not necessarily my life. So I feel like I'm in those characters because I write a lot in first person voices. And since it's coming out of me, like I creep into all my characters in different ways. But I'm actually working on my first book now, where I'm actually the main character. So which kids were always asking me, when are you going to write about yourself? But I always felt other people's lives were more interesting than mine until recently. So that's kind of a new thing for me.
I can jump in. I think it depends on, kind of like Greg is saying. By the way, thank you, Claire and Nadia, for that introduction. I meant to mention that. But I think it depends on the story. I do find that pieces of my experience, shapes the sort of the paradigm with which I approach my stories and my characters and my world building. And I think that that's an intentional choice because of sort of the kids that I'm trying to write to are specifically kids who haven't really had the opportunity to see themselves on the pages of stories, like myself when I was a middle grade reader. I'm still very much a diehard YA reader, so adults and teens alike. But I'm writing in a space which I just feel like is it's just not done often, and so I think that I intentionally try to lean into my experience growing up in an inner city community, growing up poor, growing up in a single home, like all of these single parent home, all of these things, and really normalizing them on the pages of books in hopes that kids who share those experiences come to those pages and see themselves and hopefully keep turning. Because I think as a former educator, like my goal is to trick my kid readers into loving books, because literacy is such a gateway to all sorts of things, in particular like upward mobility and like socioeconomic status. And so it's important for me to make sure that those kids feel like they have voices that speak to their lives. And so I'm writing from from me as much as I can. But I also, like Greg, think I'm pretty boring. So I'm constantly trying to figure out what can I throw in here, be it magic or, you know, something incredibly random that's exciting, to shake it up a bit.
Those are great. It's lovely to hear you both talk about your experiences. I was saying in the last panel that even when I think I'm going to be writing a completely fictionalized story that is not based on my life at all, like Eris apparently, as Claire in her lovely introduction said, it's the first book in a series that follows the descendants of Wu Zetian, who was the only female regent of China. And as you can tell from the title, there's royalty involved, there's great wealth and luxury and glamour and fashion and all that, which is not my life at all. So all of that was research. So a lot of my research was, what are the high-end brands that teens are wearing now? I have no idea. What are they wearing now? So so all of that was research, but and she's also, my main character Gemma is a teen actress who gets her big role in China, and she goes to China despite the fact that her parents' one big do not break rule is never ever step foot in Beijing. And she doesn't know why. It's a secret that's completely kept from her. So when I started writing it, I realized that that was my experience too. Not the big secret, but the fact that I did not go to Beijing until I was a teenager myself, even though that was the place where my parents were born, my grandparents, all these relatives, and I had never been. So when I was writing the story of Gemma going to Beijing for the first time, I found a lot of my own experience started seeping into it. But what I had to do research about is, I went to Beijing for the first time, and the last time I was in Beijing was a very, very long time ago. And Beijing now is very different. So a lot of the research I had to do was, what is it like culturally, politically, just the landmarks, and the street names and the restaurants, like everything has changed. So, so that definitely involved a lot of research. But I find that in writing, since the panel's title is Own Voices, and that is really important to me, that I am writing a Chinese American character, because and that is true of all my stories, except for the sequel, in which case the main character is going to be not Chinese American, but actually just Chinese, which has involved a lot of research. But the thing about writing Own Voices is that even though I'm not writing exactly my story, so much of it is fictionalized, but the heart of it, the things like the search for belonging, the search for authentic representation, is all true. And that Gemma is an actress, and she's fighting she's being asked to play these very stereotypical roles, and she's fighting for a more authentic, true representation. And it paralleled my my own story as an author in many ways, because when I was growing up, I never saw myself in the YA rom-coms that I devoured. And I always wanted to see a girl like me be the star of her own adventure and her own story, whether that was fantasy or rom-com or dystopian world. I wanted to see myself, and I never did when I was a kid. So this is a dream come true, to be writing my own voices stories now.
Yeah, and I think about like that phrase on voice, and I interpret it as own your voice, meaning even though I'm writing in another character's voice, it is literally my voice since I'm writing it. And what that allows me to do is to walk in the footsteps of a character who in some ways are like me and in other ways are completely different than me. But what that does is allow the reader to experience a character that may be totally different than them, but because, you know, I'm telling it and I'm putting myself in their place, I'm writing in a way the reader can imagine themselves in this character's place. So while on the surface, you know, I write about a lot of kind of outsider kids that you might have a negative opinion about if you just saw them or met them, you know, by accident. But because of the way I write them and put myself into it, you see them as outside of that physical thing that might separate you, and you see them in a different way that you can relate to. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking, just listening to you all talk, I'm thinking that that voice allows me to do that.
So this has been touched on a little bit, but I wanted to formally ask this question for all of you. So I know some authors, when writing books and writing characters specifically, they may sort of shape their characters in their own likeness, and sometimes they're completely different than what the author is like. So did you have any characters, main character or otherwise, that was like you, or perhaps what you wanted to be at that time, or what you wish you could have been, that sort of thing?
I can start. So in Wings of Ebony, which is my YA, it's book one in my YA duology. I think that there are pieces of me in several of the main characters. There's a grandmother character that is totally like my inner auntie. And then there's the main character, Rue, who is incredibly stubborn and hard-headed, and that is very much also voices. I've been known to be these things, ask my mother. And so I think that there are pieces of me in each of them. There are parts of the story that are very, very much Rue's story, the main character, very, very much my story. So Rue has an estranged relationship with her father, and that is definitely taken from my experience growing up without my dad. And she harbors a lot of animosity because of that towards him when he sort of shows up. And it was really, I mean, to be fully transparent, me sort of working through those issues and seeing how that part of her life shaped her life. And obviously that required me, the author, to do some uncomfortable work internally to be able to write that authentically. And then there are scenes in the book, like there's a moment where Rue is in the car with her mother and she doesn't have an explanation for her mother. It's just nighttime and they're like driving like out of town. Like they live in Houston, and so they're driving like towards, like there's more cows and trees, less buildings. So they're driving out of town and like there's a suitcase in the back, and her mother doesn't really explain where they're going. But she did pack her lunch because Rue's hungry. And that's a memory from my childhood of just waking up and my mom and I were just in the car, and there are things going on in my mother's life that I didn't understand as a child. And I didn't have context for that. I just knew my mother's love and sort of our relationship. And so you see in Wings of Ebony, Rue's mother, when the book opens, Rue's mother has been dead for a year. And so you see the ways that her relationship with her mother has shaped her, even though her mother's gone. And she constantly revisits those things. And I think that was definitely a mirror of the sort of the work that I've done internally too, as I think about those things. So I think Rue has a lot of me in her, but there's a lot of Rue that Rue is way more bold than I am. I think I tend to be a rule follower, and I think Rue sees rules as a challenge. Like if they don't exist for a reason that makes sense and that's equitable and fair to all people, she's going to not respect it, period. And she, so anyway, there's a lot of things that Rue has, namely magic, that I wish I had. So lots of similarities, some differences too.
What's interesting for me is I've written several books, you know, with a father and a son, and I find myself splitting and playing both roles because, you know, I relate to the kid who's kind of in over his head and kind of the outsider kid. It's like all these things happening to him. And I also relate to the parent, right? The parent's not just a side character, but a main character. And so I write them with equal amounts of, you know, empathy and, you know, I understand the dynamics, you know, the father's being tough on the son or whatever. So it's interesting for me to jump back and forth and play both they're like two versions of me in many cases. So it's kind of this dual schizophrenic approach. But as far as living vicariously through characters, I don't do that too much. Although the cowboy figures I've written about, I mean, I'm kind of like cowboy in some ways, like kind of that stoic, quiet, but just get it done kind of person. So I guess, you know, I'm personifying it through the actual cowboys in some of these books.
Yeah, I think there's always an element of myself in the stories I write, and definitely in the characters I write. But what was interesting for me in writing Eris, apparently, especially, is that it's a YA romance. It's a rom-com. And it was definitely the kind of story, as I said before, that I never saw myself in. So now I'm writing a character who's having this epic romantic adventure. And so I'm thinking of, as I'm writing these scenes, I'm writing from a perspective of a teenager. And then when I think back to my teen years, however, I was incredibly socially inept and romance was not an area I was skilled in. So, I mean, I don't know if it ever became an area I was skilled in, but definitely not back then. So when I'm writing these scenes, I'm thinking, oh, I don't actually have anything to draw from in terms of my own experience. But I didn't want to fall back on the tropes that I had read when I was younger. So I will confess now for a deep and abiding obsession with the Sweet Valley High books when I was a teenager. But the only Chinese American character was, I think her name was Jade, but she was very, she was a model student. She had domineering parents. She was very quiet. She was very passive. That's not me. And her story was incredibly boring. So that's not the kind of thing I wanted to draw on. I am fortunate that I'm writing in a time where there are own voices stories featuring girls of color. And that has been so important for me. And rom-coms too, featuring girls of color, Asian girls. It's been amazing. So in many ways, it's the rom-coms that I draw experience from, as I am these more diverse representative rom-coms that I'm drawing from rather than my own life and my own experience. There is one thing I did draw from I want to talk about just because it's funny. My mother actually makes the best mooncakes in the entire world. They're so good. And in Eris, apparently, I gave away her secret ingredient. And I was so nervous to tell her about that. So I told her afterwards, after she read it, and I was like, but was it okay that I gave away your secret ingredient? And she was like, it is fine. Even if you gave them the exact recipe, they'll never make it as good as I can. I just love that about her. So that was one real life. I wish I had had that quote to put in there before I wrote it, before it was published, because I just love that.
So now we've talked about sort of your experiences and yourselves and how they've shaped your work. And I know that this panel is own voices, and so that is a big theme here, but I am curious about any outside experiences or events or other people who helped influence your characters or the plot in your stories or anything like that.
Yeah, basically all my books are inspired by other people, more or less. And so, you know, the thing with me is all about listening, not only to people, but to place. you know, how those details to capture a place involves, you know, how people talk, you know, what kinds of words and expressions they use, how they dress, you know, what the attitude is and everything. And so a lot of times when I go to a place, it's really about actively listening and just like taking it all in, and collecting stories is my favorite thing. So if I'm writing about a place, I'm just collecting hundreds of stories, incidents and things that happened, you know, particularly from their point of view. And I like, you know, how one person might see it one way, another person might see that same thing in a completely different way. But that collecting all goes into shaping, you know, kind of the range of people and how they feel about this place that they all are a part of. So that's like a big part of my work, is like collecting, listening and collecting. And then once I have it, you know, it's all about shaping it. So you have all this stuff, like how do you, and it's all really great material. And how do you shape it into a single narrative? You know, how do you take all that, you know, all these different voices and put them into kind of a singular voice that can represent this place and this time. And that, so yeah, a big part of it is finding that voice that can tell that story kind of honestly or poetically honestly, you know, in a way that's true to that community. And if I do my job right, and the book comes out and I go back there and I'm talking with students from there, and this happens a lot, they think I'm actually from there, you know, like what block do you live on, you know? So that's kind of like the benchmark. If I do my job right, I captured the voice of a place with details that only someone who lived there would know, right? And even if you didn't know that because you're not from there, it really makes it come to life, because those are details that you know are true somehow. They're so offbeat or different, and yet they're just these tiny things sprinkled around. So that's my job is kind of like story hunter, going around just collecting.
So if I could take the question a little bit different direction, because I alluded to the fact that this is an amazing time and I'm so excited about much more diversity in literature. And I really feel like I would not be here as an author if certain things hadn't happened, and they happened fairly recently. So in thinking of the Own Voices movement, which in 2016, I believe, Corinne Duvis tweeted, hey, how about the hashtag Own Voices for marginalized creators writing characters who are like themselves? And it was a response to people, to authors outside of the community writing stories. So for example, so Corinne Duvis writes Own Voices stories around disabilities. So non-disabled people writing stories about people with disabilities as characters. And so that there was this wellspring, I think, of creators, not just diverse books, but diverse creators writing our own voices stories. And I think it was around that same time that We Need Diverse Books formed, which is an amazing organization. I cannot say enough about them. And they offer a mentorship program. And in 2019, I got a mentorship through We Need Diverse Books with the amazing Swathi Avashti. And I had been spinning in circles. I had written a book. I had gotten close to getting representation, but hadn't quite gotten there. And so much of what Swathi offered me was just the ability to talk about what is it to, as a woman of color, as an author, to be writing in an industry that is very white. What kinds of things do I need to consider? And just the encouragement, the constant affirmation that my work has value was so important, not to mention her incredible editorial eye that just helped me transform my story. But it was because of her mentorship that I eventually found representation. It was actually for a different book other than Eris, apparently. But I was able to get the contract for Eris apparently because of that. And so now I'm here writing these stories, and it wouldn't have been possible without that mentorship. And I realized, things sneak into your stories and you don't realize it until much later. But I have a character in my story who, Gemma, my main character in Eris, apparently, as I said, is an actress. And she is in a film that is a remake of M. Butterfly. It's set in China, and it has a white director. And the film brought in a co-director, kind of as a token, a Chinese American older director. And she becomes a mentor for Gemma, my character. And I realized that plot point became so important to me because mentorship was so important to me as a creator.
I resonate a lot with what you said, Diana. For me, I think I do definitely take like inspiration from like my family. I have 2 teenage sisters, my relationship with my mother. And I do think like, I've never, lived on a magical island. Spoiler alert. So, there are some things that I sort of have to make up with my imagination. I do think that taking inspiration sort of from the world around us and really listening and being present and being a part of our community and even engaging with other communities is so important to inform our writing. I think for me, I tend to be very, just very cautious with how I approach characters that I don't personally identify with, because I just want to be really careful that even if I do sort of research them very well, it's not the same as walking in their shoes, which I think is why the We Need Diverse Books movement, one of the reasons why it was born. And so I think I tend to sort of rely on my own relationships and experience because of that precaution, just because I would hate to unintentionally be harmful or, and I guess too, I assume that there are other people, not that the doors have always been open, so let's say that, but I do think that there are basically other writers that can do those stories better justice than I can because it comes from their own experience. So I do tend to sort of stick to worlds and communities and characters that I have some like experience adjacent from. Obviously, in a magical world, that's sort of all made up. So unfortunately, magic is not real. I've tried many times as a kid. So, but anyway, so I think most of it, like the grandmother character in my book is named after my mother's mother, and she has the personality of my father's mother. And then like the love interests, one of them is modeled after an ex of mine. One of them is modeled after my husband. I've actually never mentioned that out loud, so nobody knows that. But I don't even think he knows that. And then the sister in the book, I have multiple, I have 3 sisters, and we all have different dads. And so I wanted to model that relationship there. So again, I try to keep it sort of me adjacent. And that's both in my YA and in my middle grade magic school series, which isn't, that doesn't come out until next spring. I did similar things, pulling on my experience in middle school in an inner city community, and tried to bring things from my life or the peripheral of my life, sort of, and explore those things that I'm a little bit more comfortable to sort of speak for, for lack of a better word.
So I guess I'm trying to think of how to phrase this next question. So personally, I have read so many books, I could never even try to count them. It would be a lost cause. And I have had certain books in my life that it feels like an epiphany has happened or something. It has shaped me. It has made me into the person I have been today. And so I'm wondering if there is anything not necessarily another book, but I know we sort of went into this a little bit with the type of people or experiences that have shaped you and helped to shape the voice that you are using in your stories. Yeah. Just, is there anything that has particularly, like, it really stuck out to you, it shaped the voice that you are using in your books for other people?
I can jump in. So I think I agree with you. I couldn't name them all. And I really struggle with like favorites too. It feels so like, I feel so restricted. But I can say like, there have been books that have sort of left, like that have sat with me, and I've sort of, reading them was a very changing experience in different ways. So 3 of those books are, the first one is Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson, which is an adult literary fiction book. And there's this beautiful exploration of this child's relationship with her mother. Reading that book, like it healed parts of me that I didn't know were broken. And I think that that's just a nod to Jacqueline's talent. But there were just pieces of myself that I hadn't sat with, and that book sort of allowed me to do that in a way that felt safe and seen. So I love that one. And then the other 2 are actually very similar in terms of what they did for me. And one is Dear Martin by Nick Stone, and one is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I've always loved reading, but aside from like a few books by Alice Walker and poems by Maya Angelou, like I did not understand until I was well into adulthood that I could actually pursue being an author as like a job. I didn't, to be really just blunt, I didn't know that like people that looked like me or who came, like I came from a very poor neighborhood. I didn't go to a fancy college. Like I was the first in my family to actually go to college at all. Like I hadn't seen my life reflected on the pages, nor like in the picture on the jacket, right? So I just pursued other things, even though my love was always writing. I pursued medicine for a while and then eventually settled on law. And I ended up not doing that. And I planned to do all those things while majoring in journalism, because I selfishly was like, well, I just want to like study what I love, which is journalism. And then my minor was in rhetoric and writing. I was like, but like really, I'm going to go be a doctor or lawyer, but I'm just going to like study only writing. So I was like in denial for quite a long time about what I could do. And then when I read those books, it was just like this light went on, and I was just like, I can actually put my lived experience, my community in the pages of a novel, and like it can actually make it to a bookshelf. Like I can take my love and I can like feed my family from it. It was wow. And of course, Dear Martin and The Hate You Give were wow for many, many reasons. But on a professional level, it inspired me to, okay, like I'm going to write. And Star's voice in particular, and her neighborhood in particular, really gave me sort of the confidence to write Rue in a very authentic way, which is why her voice is incredibly unapologetic. And she is very unapologetic in her Blackness. And I did not write her for readers to, I did not write her in such a way that she sort of has to explain her existence. I wrote her for people who look like her. And then obviously I invite readers who don't to come to her world and walk through her shoes as well. But I did not write her story to explain it to outsiders. I really gave her the freedom to be herself. And that was a really powerful, just transformative experience for me as a Black woman, to feel like I can actually pen this story that is important and believe that it can actually become a book one day. And it was just, I think Angie and Nick really paved the way, and so many others, but those 2 in particular, because contemporary is my first love. Those 2 in particular just really changed my approach completely and really changed my life. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah, Alice Walker was important to me early on, just the voice that she wrote with, not only in her books, but in her poetry. But really, it was like meeting people early on in my, even before my first book came out. And it's I often say it's the authors themselves as people, even more than the writing, that influenced me, because the people I met, one automatically treated me as an equal, even though they were like, really important figureheads for me, just because I was writing, just because I had a first book, not even out yet, but it was going to come out. And they immediately treated me as an equal was surprising to me, like total validating what I was doing. And also just seeing the way their relationship they had with their readers and how personal they were with their readers. Like you could clearly see that their books dove deeper and hit deeper with their readers in a way that allowed the readers, I mean, I would personally witness like readers just opening up and revealing things to this author, maybe they've never told anybody. And so that was always in the back of my head. And, you know, I've had that experience many times since. Like if you write deeply, it hits a chord in such a way that allows another person to open up to you in a completely vulnerable way, just because you wrote that thing and you wrote it in a way that showed them it was safe for them to tell you things they would not tell anybody else, even, you know, even after just meeting them, you know, for 5 minutes even. So that, you know, I learned very early on just from being with, you know, a handful of authors and seeing them with their readers up close and personal, and how, not only how they treated them, but how they treated me, kind of gave me permission to do what I was just beginning to do, and to just keep pushing and be unafraid, you know, and to dive deep into the pool.
I really wish I had saved my last answer for this question, but I'm going to try to continue. But first of all the authors that both Jay and Greg mentioned, Angie Thomas, Nick Stone, Alice Walker, these are some of my favorite authors. And I'm scared of naming more because I'm afraid I'm going to leave out someone very, very important. So I'm just going to piggyback off of theirs. And say that, unlike Jay, I had the conviction from a very young age, even though I never saw myself in the books I read, that I was going to be an author. So I went to graduate school. I was getting my MFA, and that's where that dream of being an author went. Crashed and burned. I was in writing workshops where I was told things like, you know, for revision, why don't you make your main character white? Why not? Just try that on. And I was kind of like, why? Just why would you tell a white student to make their main character a different race just because, to try it on? And so it was just, and also I was trying to write what I thought I had to write, because what little I saw of Asian American writers was literary writers. I did not see kidlit authors who were also Asian. So that's what I thought I had to write, was, you know, whatever literature was supposed to be. And so it was not that growth, that nurturing, that experience I thought it was going to be. So I kind of quietly put my dreams of being an author on the shelf. But I did become a teacher, which is amazing. And eventually I taught some creative writing classes. And I remember one creative writing class in particular where my students had gotten the same message I had, which is that the only valid writing we do in these creative writing classes is what is arbitrarily considered literary. So I went in and I said, you know what? You can write whatever you want. You can write genre fiction, you can write fan fiction, you can whatever. And so they were like, can I write fantasy? And I was like, yes, write fantasy, love it. Can I write horror? Know nothing about horror, but yes. Can I write from the anthropomorphic viewpoint of a cat? That's horrifying, but absolutely. No, I didn't say that's horrifying. I said absolutely. And so after this day, I felt good. They felt good. They were going off to write. Oh, are we out of time?
We have 5-minute warning. So actually at this point, a 4-minute warning. So I wanted people to know that. So we can start wrapping things up.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Yep, there she froze.
I want. So I did, and that was YA middle grade. That's what I wanted to write. So that was an amazing transformative moment for me.
As a Mexican American person myself, who has always found writing to be very therapeutic and fun and something I've wanted to pursue, you are the kind of authors that make me feel that I can reach my dream. I don't have to put it on the shelf. I can do whatever I wish to, whether it's write a novel or film a movie, any of these things. Do you have any last minute advice for anyone who wants to potentially go down the same path as you and use their own voice to write their own story?
Well, one thing I always tell kids is because there's a perception like there's a distinct way to write a book, like it's literary, and this assumption that, great authors just sit down and everything they write is a masterpiece. I say there's no right or wrong way to tell a story. There is only your way. And that everybody I've ever met I guarantee has a story worth telling. And it's just a matter of giving yourself permission to tell that story, which is the biggest thing, because a lot of young people think maybe they're not qualified or they can't do it or they don't have the talent. It's like everybody knows how to tell a story. Every time you sit with your friends and you're like, oh, you won't believe what I saw yesterday. And you can hook them. They give verbal responses like, what? Oh. And so they just have to literally tell that same kind of story, but it's just using words on paper as opposed to coming out of your mouth. So it's just a matter of discovering your voice, and that requires playing around with different forms, poetry, short stories, whatever, but it'll come.
We have a really great comment in the chat, and I was wondering if we'd like to share that with everyone.
Oh, yeah. So from Miss Ananya, I'm so sorry, I'm really bad with names. She said, or they said, I apologize.
That was actually really good. Ananya, thank you.
Ananya.
You got it very
right. She said, again, I'm so sorry. It's so reassuring to see successful authors that write stories with the main characters like themselves. I like to write magic and witches and monsters, but for a long time, my main characters were blonde girls with names like Kate or Nancy, with stay-home moms and spaghetti for dinner. Thank you.
I was actually gonna shout them out, Ananya. I was gonna say, I want to read your monster stories and your witches ones. And I think just to sort of echo what's been said about writing your own stories, I think if you're like me, sometimes I think that we can get in our head a bit about what is the story going to be? Like, can I get it to a bookshelf? Am I allowed to do this? Do I have the time? Like, should I be working on something more practical? Because that was a big pressure for me as the first person in my family to go to college, the first person to graduate from high school, actually. I felt like it was frivolous time spent. And the dedication to Wings of Ebony says, and to you, reader, there's an ember in you that's hungry to burn. That is your magic. Let it. And I think that spirit really sort of captures the advice that I would give to inspiring writers like you, Nadia, if you want to write. It's just that if words are calling to you, like, listen and answer them. And I would encourage you, especially now with the We Need Diverse Books movement so on fire, to not really think about where the story is going to go. Focus on the fact that the story is calling to you. It needs to be written, and only you can tell it in your way. And even if that's as far as you get, like if all you do is spit the story out and get it down, That's the best possible start, because you can't revise a story or publish a story that doesn't exist. So get over the first hump and just like spit it out, get it on paper, and then get connected to figure out what to do next. You're welcome to message me or contact me on my website. But I encourage you all to just write those stories calling to you, because we need them. Kids need them. Kids are salivating for books that make them feel seen.
Absolutely. Just what Greg and Jay said. We need your stories. Please write them.
It looks like we are out of time, but thank you three so much for your books and your stories and your own voices. Thank you, thank you, thank you. To everyone who hasn't read them, they should read them. They are wonderful. These people are wonderful. And I hope you all have a very good day.
Thank you so much. So nice meeting you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nice to meet
There
you
are
all.
some additional sessions running during the lunch time for writers workshop. I think there was at least one, and if you get a chance, take a look at the shops.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.